Football was never supposed to exist here. Not this far north, not in a place where winter shallows the sun for months and summer refuses to let it disappear. Above the Arctic Circle, where darkness becomes routine and silence often feels heavier than noise, football should have never been more than a pastime, not something meant for Europe. And yet, this season, something happened that forced the football world to look north. For the first time in their history, Bodø Glimt stepped onto the stage of the Champions League. Not as a novelty, not as a name filling the schedule, they arrived as a club that belonged. And then they started winning. 3 Champions League matches in a row, something no Norwegian club had ever achieved before. Not against modest opposition, but against clubs built on everything Bodø is not. Clubs shaped by money, power, and decades of European history. Manchester City, Atletico Madrid, Inter. Names that were never supposed to travel this far north. Suddenly, this was no longer a story about participation, it became a story about disruption. Because if football can thrive here, in a small coastal town shaped by cold, darkness and distance, then the rules we think govern this game began to feel fragile. This wasn't luck anymore, and it certainly wasn't coincidence. It was the result of a club that learned how to endure long before it ever learned how to win. So the question isn't how impressive this run is, the real question is far simpler and far more uncomfortable. How did football survive here long enough to make it all possible? Welcome to Hidden Club Stories, where every club carries a story. This is the story of Bodø Glimt. This episode is sponsored by Hidden Shirt Club. They sell football shirt mystery boxes with real stories. Bodø is not a football city. It is a small coastal town in northern Norway, located above the Arctic Circle, where nature dictates the rhythm of daily life. Here, seasons do not fade gently into one another, they switch. In winter, sun disappears entirely. Weeks pass without daylight, darkness becomes normal. In summer, night never truly arrives. The sky remains awake long after the body expects rest. Life adapts to this rhythm. You learn patience, you learn resilience, you learn to live alongside forces you cannot control. Football in a place like this is not entertainment, it is resistance. Bodø Glimt was founded in 1916, not as a statement, but as something practical. A reason to gather, a reason to move, a reason to stay connected when geography tries to isolate you. For decades, the club lived on the margins of Norwegian football, not because of lack of passion, but because of distance. Southern Norway dominated the conversation. Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim. The north was always something else, the travel was long, the weather was unpredictable, and the facilities were improvised. For visiting teams, Bodø was uncomfortable, not hostile, just unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity has a way of unsettling footballers. Aspina Stadium sits open to the elements, wind, cold, and timing matter. Opponents feel it immediately. For Bodø Glimt, this was never a disadvantage, it was normal. Players grew up training in conditions others complain about. Playing when quitting would have felt understandable. Here, football was never polished, it was functional. And slowly, almost unnoticed, that functionality turned into strength. While the rest of Europe optimized for comfort, Bodø learned how to perform without it. Without the warmth, without light, without attention. For a long time, no one noticed. Which is exactly how this story was allowed to grow. For most of its existence, Bodø Glimt was not a club people talked about. Not with admiration, not with expectation. Founded in 1916, the club spent decades moving quietly through Norwegian football, rarely staying in one place for too long. Promotion was often followed by relegation, moments of promise faded into long stretches of survival. Norwegian football had its fixed centers of gravity, Trondheim, Oslo, the south. The north was always bearable. Too far, too cold, too impractical. For a long time, Clubs from northern Norway weren't even considered suitable for the highest level of the game. Travel was expensive, conditions unpredictable, and the logistics were complicated. When Bodø Glimt finally reached the top division, it never felt permanent. They were visitors, allowed in, but never expected to stay. The club's first league title in 1975 should have rewritten that narrative. Instead, it became an exception, a moment remembered for its rarity rather than for what followed. Because consistency never arrived. Decades had passed, generations of players came and went. The club drifted between relevance and obscurity. By the early 2010s, Bodø Glimt was fragile again. Finances were tight, expectation modest, ambition reduced to staying afloat. And then, in 2017, the ground gave way. Relegation arrived. For most clubs, this is painful but manageable. For a club this far north, it was dangerous. Lower divisions meant less visibility, less money, less reason for players to travel north at all. This was the kind of moment where clubs quietly shrink, where stories end without drama, but Bodø Glimt didn't disappear. Instead, something shifted. After relegation, Bodø Glimt resisted to instinctive panic. There were no emergency signings, no desperate promises, no attempt to copy richer clubs. Instead, the club asked a different question. Not how do we get back quickly, but who are we really? The answer wasn't tactical, it was physiological. Fear had shaped too many decisions, the fear of losing, the fear of making mistakes, the fear of falling again. Bodø Glimt decided to remove fear from the process entirely. Joy became the foundation, not as a slogan, but as a working principle. Training was rebuilt around expression, mistakes were treated as information, not failure, players were encouraged to take risks, to play forward and to trust movement and instinct. Mental coaches became as important as a physical preparation. Data wasn't used to restrict players, but to give them clarity. The football followed naturally. They played high-pressing football with relentless movement and quick circulation. Not because it was fashionable, but because it fit the environment. The cold demands intensity, artificial pitches reward speed, and long travel punishes passive football. What once felt like disadvantages were reimagined as tools. The response was immediate. Promotion followed within the year. But what happened after promotion? Everything changed. Bodø Glimt didn't just return to the top division, they transformed it. In 2020, the club didn't merely compete for the title, they overwhelmed the league. Goals came freely, confidence grew visible, matches were played with an authority. No one associated with a northern club. This wasn't survival anymore, it was identity. And most importantly, it wasn't abandoned once success arrived. Bodø Glimt stayed faithful to the process, to joy over fear, to preparation over panic. And quietly, a club that had spent decades enduring had built something that could travel. For a long time, what Bodø Glimt was building felt local. Impressive, maybe. Interesting, certainly. But still contained within Norway. That changed the moment Europe arrived. Not with respect, not with expectation, but with curiosity. Bodø Glimt entered European competition as a team people underestimated by default. They were too small, they lived too far north, and they were just too unfamiliar. What visiting teams prepared for was discomfort. Cold nights, artificial turf, long travel. Everybody knows those things. What they didn't prepare for was football. The tempo arrived earlier than expected, the pressing closed spaces faster than anticipated, the confidence never dipped. Bodø Glimt didn't adapt to Europe, they forced Europe to adapt to them. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. This wasn't a northern novelty anymore, this was a tactical problem. When Bodø Glimt defeated AS Roma in European competition, it was no longer treated as a lucky night. It was treated as a warning. A sign that something deeper was taking shape far from football's traditional centers. What followed wasn't a single European moment, it was continuity. Season after season, Bodø Glimt returned to the continent. Not to survive, but to compete. And in the 2024-2025 season, they went further than anyone expected, all the way to the Europa League semi-finals. Not as a surprising guest, not as a team clinging on, but as a side that looked comfortable at every level. By then, Europe had stopped asking how this was happening. The question had quietly shifted to something else entirely. How far could this actually go? By the time Bodø Glimt reached the Champions League, it felt inevitable. Not because it was expected, but because the groundwork had already been laid. Still, stepping in the Champions League was different. This was not a tournament built for clubs like Bodø Glimt. It was built for global brands, for cities with millions of people, for institutions shaped by decades of power. And yet, for the first time in their history, Bodø Glimt were there. Not as a reward, but as a consequence. What followed surprised even those who believed most deeply in this project. Bodø Glimt didn't just compete, they won. 3 matches in a row, a record no Norwegian club had ever achieved before. And it wasn't against some small clubs, it came against clubs whose names alone reshape expectations. Manchester City, Athletic Madrid, Inter. Not as one-off moments of chaos, but as performances rooted in structure. The pressing was the same, the movement unchanged, the confidence intact. Bodø Glimt played as if the badge on the opposition shirt did not alter the task in front of them. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part. There was no hesitation, no attempt to protect the result, only belief. For Norwegian football, this season marked a shift. For Bodø Glimt, it was confirmation. This wasn't a miracle, it was continuity. A club played its first ever Champions League campaign, had rewritten what participation could look like. And above the Arctic Circle, football was no longer surviving, it was thriving. What Bodø Glimt achieved this season will be remembered for the results. Their Champions League debut, their victories, their records. But that's not where the real story lives. Because Bodø Glimt did not appear suddenly, they didn't arrive through shortcuts, they didn't bend their identity to fit the stage. They brought the same ideas that the North had always demanded of them. Preparation instead of panic, movement instead of control, joy instead of fear. This football wasn't designed for television, it was football shaped by circumstance, by darkness that forces patience, by distance that demands self-reliance, by an environment where excuses don't survive long. Bodø Glimt learned how to endure long before they learned how to dominate. And when the stage finally arrived, they didn't change. They trusted what had already carried them through years where no one was watching them. That is why this season didn't feel like a miracle, it felt like alignment. For smaller clubs across Europe, Bodø Glimt represents something rare. Proof that identity can scale, that preparation can outgrow reputation, that clarity can survive pressure. Not every club can become Bodø Glimt, but every club can learn from them. Because this story was never about geography, it was about refusing to believe that certain places are not meant to matter. Above the Arctic Circle, football was never supposed to thrive. The nights were too long, the winters too harsh, the distances too unforgiving. And yet it did. Not because conditions improved, but because people adapt. Because a club decided to stop apologizing for where it came from. Because players learned to trust movement when fear would have been easier. Because a place that had always been asked to endure finally learned how to impose itself. This season will be remembered. But Bodø Glimt is not defined by 1 year. It is defined by the quiet years, by the discipline built in isolation, by the belief formed far from the center of attention. Football will always belong to the biggest cities, to the richest clubs, to the loudest names, but sometimes it also finds a way to places where it was never meant to exist. and when it does, it reminds us why this game still matters. Thank you for watching this episode of Hidden Club Stories. If you want to discover more clubs with identity, history and soul, make sure to subscribe, because somewhere out there, another story is already waiting.